Hello. This is not one of those talks that has been sponsored. I haven't got a book to plug and I'm not selling anything, although I do have something I want to promote. It's not about me, but I do need to start with some personalization. Poor mental health has affected a lot of my adult life, and especially my career as an English language teacher. On 12 separate occasions, I have either left a job early, not completed a contract, or been successful in an interview and then not started due to a lack of confidence. I've had long periods of depression and suffered from anxiety and lots of panic attacks. I spent a week in a secure unit. I've also spent 2 IATEFL conferences suffering from acute anxiety, including not being able to leave my hotel room. Last February I did an interview for Time to Talk Day in which I first went public about my struggles. It got an amazing response, and the seed for this talk was sown. And a year ago, I was inspired by Sarah Mercer's IATEFL plenary on teacher psychology and well-being. I later met her and she gave me advice on doing my own original research into this area, which is what I want to focus on today. But first of all, I'd like to share a quotation. This idea of human resources will come back up later in the talk. This quotation actually comes from a book called The Elephant in the Staff Room. It was written by a religious studies teacher in a sixth form college in the UK. The title caught my eye and the subtitle goes even further: How to Reduce Stress and Improve Teacher Wellbeing. Now, although the author wrote this with the background of state education sector in the UK, the issues it raises and the great advice that is on offer can be transposed to the English language teaching profession. I wrote the abstract for my talk last July, so the idea for the content was not fully formed, so apologies if I deviate slightly. I was going to discuss existing research, but to be honest, I didn't find much. Not academic research anyway. There was this National Health Survey from the Education Support Partnership, which looked at the mental health and well-being of over 1,000 state sector professionals in the UK, mostly schools. But as you know, we are an international bunch and we're not limited by country or even the languages we teach. I found one piece about the effect of perfectionism on burnout and anxiety among 256 Iranian teachers of English, a relevant topic, but quite a specific study group. More recently, however, this book has been published. It is a substantial collection of academic research papers put together by Sarah Mercer once more and Achilles Kostoulis. It was published only this year. Now, I did not have this book, or the Health Survey report, or any other substantial pieces of academic research when I came to do my own. But what I did have access to comes next, something a little bit less academic and quite a lot more personal. I began to make notes of every blog post written on the topic. I remember seeing one in 2015 by Laura Patsko about Time to Talk Day, and another post about a project in Barcelona called the Mental Health Friendly Initiative. Following my own interview for Time to Talk Day last February, Sandy Millen posted some useful links on mental health and ELT, quickly followed by Ellie Settersfield's wonderful post, The A to Z of Self-Care for Teachers. There were quite a lot of posts published last year, and these are just a few more examples. There's Rosalie Serra talking about burnout, Lizzie Pinard, Kieran O'Driscoll, and Claire Mass. Sandy keeps updating her list, and I produced my own list of useful links at the end of last year, which included some posts which had been shared via the survey as part of my own research. So, moving on to the research. This was carried out in December last year. Having devised a set of questions, I asked a group of 5 to be my pilot group. My pilot group road tested the questions, completed the survey, and offered feedback. I then went live. I followed the British Association of Applied Linguistics recommendations for good practice. I had to reassure informants wishing to remain anonymous because of the sensitive nature of the answers and who had access to it. Well, just me actually. And the 14 questions were mostly open-ended and had no limit on how much the informants could write. I published the request on the 1st of December and it was widely shared. I was hoping to get maybe 150 responses in total. I got 156 in just the first 24 hours. I got another 100 in the next 24 hours. In the end, I got so overwhelmed by the response that I had to close the survey request on the 21st of December after just 3 weeks. By the time I had removed duplicate entries, I was left with 501 individual responses or completions from around the world. When I copied and pasted the complete answers into a Word document, it ran to 178 pages and over 66,600 words. Only the first 2 questions were closed, and they asked for informants' roles in their profession. The first one asked for their roles. The vast majority were or are teachers, but many are also teacher trainers. Quite a high percentage were freelancers. The second question simply asked how long they've been in the English teaching profession, and as you can see, there's a wide range of experience, over 57% stating that they had 11 or more years. For the remaining questions, informants were allowed to leave answers blank, but were encouraged to write not applicable or similar where possible. What follows is a brief look at some of the questions in the survey, but I have written an extensive blog post which I've published today, which I will share a link to at the end. I wondered how diagnosed and undiagnosed conditions are dealt with in the workplace. Firstly, I asked whether informants had or had ever been given a diagnosed condition. By diagnosed, I mean that a doctor, consultant, or other medical professional has made a decision that the person has this condition. 325 said none, or had never had a diagnosis. 93 different informants stated depression or some variation. 67 stated that they had been diagnosed with some kind of anxiety. This includes generalized anxiety disorder, which is what I was diagnosed with myself in 2012. 8 said post-traumatic stress disorder. Some said obsessive-compulsive disorder. 4 stated burnout, although this is not strictly a disorder or mental health condition. 4 stated suicidal ideation, which is the preoccupation with thoughts of ending your own life and how to go about it. A couple said dystemy, which I managed to work out was dysthemia, which is a mood order. I must point out that many informants had a combination or multiple diagnoses at different times. Some were temporary, others were more permanent, and many would have been medicated for. The survey also asked if the informant feels that they suffer from an undiagnosed mental health condition. They were invited to explain their answer. 70 less people answered this question than the previous one, probably because if they disclosed a diagnosed one, they probably didn't need to answer this question. Now, it's harder to categorise undiagnosed conditions, especially when people are asked to self-describe. Some of the symptoms were elaborated upon in the following question. Stress now features here. This is common. Again, like burnout, not an actual diagnosis, although people can be off sick with exhaustion. Stress is felt and known without sufferers needing a medical professional to tell them. Some stress, and indeed a certain level of anxiety, can be okay. In fact, some people thrive on it. But it's when it becomes too much that it becomes a problem. A lot of people described physical symptoms such as knotted stomach, muscle cramps, migraines. Some people mentioned insomnia, short-term memory loss. Some mentioned substance abuse or substance dependency here, and addiction, but not in serious numbers. A follow-up question asked whether a mental health issue in the workplace had affected attendance or performance. Although everyone responded, 301 simply said no. A further 36 simply said yes, without elaborating. It's difficult to summarise approximately 160 responses who did explain what had happened. Individual stories in specific situations and quite personal. It makes it hard to generalise, but these stories included workplace anxiety, panic attacks, severe depression, feeling burnout, insomnia, being hospitalised, and resigning. Here is one example quotation. I'll let you have a look at it. As I said, this is an example of one quotation taken directly from the survey. Somebody else wrote this in response. It didn't affect attendance, but I don't understand what you mean by in the workplace. If you have suffered from depression, it's 24 hours a day, so I would not classify it as in the workplace. It is difficult to say whether depression or depressive episodes affected my performance. I couldn't simplify it in those management speak terms. I would say it affected my ability to feel things fully and live a happy life. My performance wasn't at the top of my list of concerns. What was more relevant is the question about whether those informants felt supported in the workplace, and in what ways. Several examples were given, and I had about 200 responses to this. This included someone who stated that they had received tremendous support and were able to see a staff counsellor. They'd also commented at length about there being little information in the ELT industry and wanted to carry out their own research into teacher anxiety. However, the majority of responses were negative here, a lack of support. Many did not fully explain what was wrong or how they were suffering for fear of reprisals in many cases. Being given less responsibility might be okay for some, but being given a lighter workload or treated with kid gloves can have an adverse effect. Again, here's just one example from the survey responses. Another question from the survey was this: as an employee, would you feel comfortable disclosing a mental health condition up front or in an interview? I'll leave you to think about this just for a moment. So what do you think? What do you think the majority of people said? Well, 75 to 80% came down on one side of this. Approximately 280 said no, and another 120 said not ever, not really, or never, before saying why. Most commonly, they expressed stigma, the perception of disclosure, the fear of not being hired, cultural issues such as South Korea or Japan, and they wouldn't get the required support. Here is just one response from the survey. I'll let you read it. So, this former school owner, school coordinator, said that they just didn't have the right skills and information how to deal with the situation, and that it was a business decision that made it difficult as well. Now, I counted 73% who said yes before giving their reasons to this question. A minority of informants were keen to express the importance of a condition being out in the open. A few wanted to receive understanding or possible support if they felt it might be there in the workplace. Many directly wanted to challenge the established stigma and the prejudice faced. Again, here is just one answer. There are many more reasons for both why people would or wouldn't disclose this upfront on my blog post, which I'll share at the end of the talk. I'd like you to think about this question now. What kinds of factors do you think could be a cause of stress for language teachers? This question resulted in the biggest response of all in terms of the most words written, over 13,000. Many wrote mini life stories and long lists of answers. I'll show you just 3 key words. Perfectionism, workload, job insecurity. These are in no particular order and are just some of the factors raised. Here are a load more. So, some things we might expect: culture shock, unmotivated students, unrealistic expectations where students are asked to progress at a rapid rate and in a short time frame. Imposter syndrome, that feeling of thinking that you're a fraud and that at any moment you're going to be uncovered. Something I've suffered from myself when I first started out as a teacher. Also worth noting, harassment and bullying. A lot of harassment and bullying issues and stories came up in this research and in the survey responses. Not just in this question, by the way. Something that Sarah Mercer has highlighted in a recent webinar is the idea of perception of stress. Stress occurs when there is a mismatch between the perceived pressures of the work situation and the individual's ability to cope with it. Here are a couple of quotes that I'll share from the survey. As I say, these are just two examples of the responses I received. And obviously there were a lot of responses where there was a combination of factors. It wasn't just one solitary issue. A lower response was received on this question because this was targeted at employers and managers. In some ways the question is a bit narrow because it asked how confident did they feel at recognising symptoms. Obviously, we expect a lower response, only 181 responses to this, but many stated in their own words how confident they felt. I'll show you a couple of quotes. One from a person that said they were confident. And another one from somebody who felt they were not confident. Now, where there is a lack of confidence, it can be traced back to the question about disclosure up front or in a job interview. Employees hold information back and are often good at hiding their symptoms. Let's remember that signs of mental distress are not always obvious and can be covered up in a way that more physical symptoms can't. A lot of anxiety comes from suppressing feelings and not being able to share internal concerns in an appropriate way, or there are external factors which the person doesn't want to raise, making it difficult for the problems to be addressed. The next two questions are related. In fact, they overlap somewhat. They relate to how individuals manage their symptoms. The first one asked about tactics or coping mechanisms. The difference, I'd say, between these two are that tactics are generally positive methods and steps taken to alleviate or deal with the stresses of work. Coping mechanisms, however, are generally ways of getting through a situation, not necessarily the healthy option. So I think of drinking, smoking, or heavily relying on prescribed medication as other examples. Here are some of the words that were used. So we can see medication, which is commonly taken, although some people get over-reliant upon medication and use it as a sort of crutch. I'm thinking of diazepam, for example, where it's meant to be a short-term thing and people use it repeatedly and it becomes almost worthless. Meditation, which is positively encouraged in some cultures, and mindfulness, and you may have just come from a session on mindfulness, and this is being practiced more and more, and it's becoming more and more common for teachers to practice this as a way to deal with everyday stresses. Here is just one answer that came from the survey. I'd like you to read this. Another question, which was similar to the previous one, is the management of symptoms includes positive ways to look after mental well-being. Now, there's only time to briefly show you some of the responses here. Some sessions at IATEFL deal in much more detail about ways of improving one's own mental well-being. I'm going to show you a list of responses. Physical exercise, rated very highly on people's agendas. Again, meditation was quite common. Diet and eating well, getting enough sleep, some basic factors which if you don't get in place can have a knock-on effect to your well-being. physical and mental side of things that are often interlinked, and I'm going to show you a quote in a moment which refers to that. A lot of people talked about taking time off and having a life outside of work. One person mentioned hip dancing, and a couple of people mentioned that faith had helped them. Here's one example. So, eating healthily, having routines, good night's sleep, mental and physical health, so intermingled. This is so true. If ELT professionals are to improve their own mental health, it is critical to know that they are not alone and can talk about this. There's so much to learn from others, from your peers. Like most of the questions in this survey, the extensive responses could have formed their own separate blog post or book chapter. Turning to this final question though, it's not just about the individual, of course. This question looked at the ways that employers and institutions could support the employer. It can be linked with the external factors given as the causes of stress in the earlier question. And this question also received a huge response, over 10,000 words. As I put my blog post together, I made a few word clouds to pick out some of the key terms, and you can see them here. These are the word cloud from all of the keywords that come from just the answer to this question alone. Now, training featured highly in this response, 61 individual mentions. In fact, another question separately asked specifically about training to support teachers. Counselling and awareness raising also featured highly in the responses. Recognizing signs came up in an earlier question, and some managers felt confident, but it is not always about managers being able to detect signs which are being kept hidden by the employee. It is also about creating an atmosphere in which these issues can be raised. Management should be open to receiving feedback about those factors which cause stress and not dismiss or minimize concerns. Problems with low pay, low levels of pay, poor conditions and insecurity are widespread within our industry. While some teachers go into this work with pre-existing medical conditions, some of these are exacerbated by the working conditions in which they face. I just want to show you two quotes that came out of this question, and they're polar opposites in their answer. Now, you may recognize the sentiments behind these quotes on the right. The lower quote actually comes from the final question of the survey, which asks for any other views not covered by the previous ones. There are moves such as ELT Advocacy Ireland, Unite the Union, and other bodies seeking to resolve some of these endemic problems. Unionised support is certainly possible at a local level, but it's more difficult on an international level. Again, I refer you to my blog post for a wider selection of wide-ranging comments on this question. Okay, so to conclude, with such a tremendous response to the survey, the topic clearly hit a nerve with many in the profession. It managed to draw out some qualitative responses from many who had previously suffered from poor mental health in the past and many who still do. It received contributions from those with no direct experience but were eager to know more. One informant stated clearly that mental health is not something that should be discussed, it is something that should be treated. Now, while I agree with the second part, be it medication, counselling or therapy, not talking about it is not the way forward. I am an advocate for time to change, which seeks to challenge the stigma and discrimination about mental health issues. No one should have to face a problem alone. The discussion must be open and continue until we reach the point of it being normalised. The survey did not deal with the question of whether teachers go into the profession with existing conditions, which are then exacerbated by the working conditions that they faced. So it would be unwise to draw any conclusions that the profession itself causes poor mental health. Nonetheless, some of the working conditions and experiences don't help. A lot of anecdotal evidence in the survey that came out of the survey showed that those who do suffer had learned how to cope or walk away. Many had clearly developed ways of looking after their well-being, while others sought to blame systemic or organizational issues outside of their immediate control. Many felt for years that they were the problem, not the external context of their employment. Whilst we can sympathise with institutions needing a reliable workforce, the constant strive to be competitive and the business demands of many ELT situations can lead to teachers being undervalued, mere commodities in the process. We are people, not disposable human resources. As one person stated, until teachers are treated as people and not commodities, then the whole mental health issue in ELT is not going to change. Thank you very much.